So you'll notice in the notes, we next go to lesson 4.7. We were just in lesson 4.3. 4.4, 4.5, and 4.6, I think all three of those lessons, or at least two of the three, have to do with graphing the trig functions. So graphing sine, graphing cosine, tangent, cotangent, secant, cosecant, graphing them by hand, not just plugging them in on the calculator, but knowing how to graph them by hand. We are going to do that later on. Okay, so usually I'll do 4.7, and then I'll do 4.8, and then we'll have a test over that bulk part of chapter 4, and then I come back and teach the graphing separately. Okay, so we will come back and do that, I'll do it in a separate section. And so today we are starting to introduce the inverse trig functions. Now, when I say inverse trig functions, you notice there it says inverse sine function is y equals sine negative 1x. This is where the second function on your calculator comes in. You know, when we were doing reciprocals, I said you can't do second sine, second cosine, second tangent. That's because it represents the inverse function. Okay, so it's going to go more with what we're doing today. So, and you'll notice anytime I've talked about doing the reciprocal of something, for instance, earlier today when I said we were doing the reciprocal of tangent, I didn't write tangent negative 1x, I wrote tangent of x raised to the negative 1. That's how we write it when we want to talk about a reciprocal, okay, which is not what we're talking about today. We're talking about the inverse trig functions. Now, do you remember anything about inverse functions from algebra?
It's been a minute, I'm not going to lie.
Degrees.
Okay, I know what I see what you're
The
going.
angle, it's finding the angle from the two.
Okay. So we're gonna be working backwards today. Okay, I see where you're going with that. Not exactly what I was looking for, but yes, that's where we're going. In other words, instead of finding the number in the chart today, we're gonna be finding the angle. We're gonna be working backwards. Now, if we go back to algebra and we talk about inverse functions, which my Algebra 2 kids just learned about last week. Okay, inverse functions are when you take the x value and the y value and you switch them, right? That's an inverse function. Inverse trig functions are the same way. Okay, instead of our input being the angle and our output being the value on the chart, we're going to reverse that. Our input is going to be the value on the chart, and our output is going to be the angle. Okay, so that's the idea. Now, as we go in here, a little bit of information. First of all, I believe in your book. I assume they do in these new books. I did not pay attention to this, but also realize you may see arc sine in your homework. And arc sine x is another way to write the inverse function. Okay? I assume they still put that in there. As I said, it didn't even occur to me until just now to check and see. But I assume you're going to see that when you go to do the homework. Depending on which portions of homework I assigned, I do see it a little bit. I don't see it very much. Okay. So, a negative 1 power right after the trig function before the x means inverse function. Also can be written as arc. Okay? Now, okay, domain. Domain is important here. The domain of the inverse sine function is negative 1 to 1. That means when you are putting values in for x, they have to be a value between negative 1 and 1. Otherwise, if on your calculator you would try to do sine inverse of a value outside of that domain, it's going to give you an error. It's not possible. Sine inverse will only work with domain values of negative 1 to 1. Now, on the flip side of that, the range. So range is going to be my output. Remember what we talked about, since we're switching our input and output here, our output is our angle. And for sine, our range, our answers, always have to be between negative pi over 2 and positive pi over 2. Now, this means that we may have to rename some angles to make sure we just give the correct name. But we have to make sure we are in that piece. And as reviewed, domain is X, range is Y. Okay. We already talked about this with your class, right? The answer to an inverse sine function is an angle. When you have an inverse sine function, we're going to have the value on the chart. The answer is an angle. So just the opposite from what we've been working with. Okay. We're going to start basic. Now, notice example 1, this is without a calculator. Where answers we're going to be working in today, I'm looking for radians is what I want to write down. Not that we can't equivalent degrees. You guys know my feelings on that, but let's talk radians. Okay. Sine inverse of 1/2. What are we thinking? Pi over 6. Yes? No?
Yeah, 5 over 6 because it's the answer. Yeah.
Okay. So first of all, realize this 1/2 is my domain, it's my input. Always double check, because it can get tricky here. Is that in the accepted domain area? Yes, it is. -1 to 1, -1/2, it's good. So then the output here is pi over 6. And that is going to be my range value. Now, do we agree with pi over 6? And that's because what? You go on the chart, you find sine, you find 1/2, and which angle does that match up with? 30 degrees or pi over 6, yes? Okay, this is how inverse functions work. Now, is pi over 6 in an accepted range? Does it fall in between negative pi over 2 and positive pi over 2? Yeah, in other words, basically, does 1/6 fall between negative 1/2 and positive 1/2?
Yeah.
And it does. Okay, now, one thing that I didn't think to show you, I need to show you this. If you flip to the back of this page, I believe it's where it's at. It's not. Okay. Used to have something that looks like this, right? And with that in mind, I'm going to move this. Come on, move. There we go. Okay. With that in mind, notice right here is our sine inverse, right? What this shows is this shows your accepted range values. Okay? And that kind of puts it in a graph form, so to speak. But these are the accepted range values. So whenever you give a sine inverse function, it has to land somewhere between negative pi over 2 and positive pi over 2. And it's helpful to think about, so where does that mean our answers have to land? Somewhere in quadrant 1 or quadrant 4. Basically, if we're talking about a positive sign, we're going to be up here in quadrant 1, because that's our all quadrant, right? If we're talking about a negative sign value, well, you're going to be down here in quadrant 4. Also means we might have to rename some angles. And remember, this is also the same as saying negative 90 to positive 90. Okay? But we're not going to talk 270. Because notice, this doesn't say, I agree it's 270, but this doesn't say 3 pi over 2, does it? It's negative pi over 2. So that's the thing. Anytime we give an answer here, I'm not going to give an answer of 300 degrees. Okay? I'm going to give an answer of, or 5 pi over 3. I'm going to give an answer of negative 3 pi over 3. Or, excuse me, negative pi over 3. Okay? So we'll work with that more tomorrow. That's just kind of a little introduction there. We'll also talk about cosine and tangent and what all that means. Okay? So, come tomorrow. Ready to do a little bit of quizzing.